The only thing worse than the weather right now is the infrastructure. Aside from the roads being awful in this parking lot, downtown Dearborn Heights is basically entirely car oriented. If you want to walk, it's kind of a death sentence, I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, it's not a good place to walk around, and this is the case with the majority of the suburbs or the cities around Detroit. Yeah, unfortunately isn't like a uncommon sights. So that might be a bit of an overstatement, but legitimately speaking, we do have an overemphasis on car infrastructure. Now for this project, the sustainability goal that I'm looking at is sustainability goal number 11 from the UN. That UN goal is about sustainable cities, and I'm specifically looking at public transportation, mainly in the Metro Detroit area. That's at least what I use as examples, but I will mention a couple other cities, both domestically and abroad. Now, one term I want to get out of the way before really getting into it is walkability. Walkability sounds pretty self-explanatory, like how much you're able to walk around a certain area. It really focuses on the social and physical boundaries that someone can walk within cities and just in general. According to the Biomedical Central website from 2022, walkability is a term used to describe aspects of the built-in and social environment that have important population-level impacts on physical activity, energy balance, and health. And the overall pattern is that in the United States, the walkability of cities is drastically lower than the rest of the world. That was rough, the intersection here, Michigan Avenue and Outer Drive, but it is what it is. Now, the actual statement of the problem that I want to make is that cities need a variety of infrastructure to be sustainable, and with only creating road infrastructure, Southeastern Michigan struggles to create a sustainable environment. Now, with getting into the literature review, we have to look a little bit into the history of Southeastern Michigan, specifically with road infrastructure and an emphasis on automobiles. You know, this is the motor city after all. In terms of transportation, automobiles have existed at least since the late 1800s, and a lot of companies started in the early 1900s, like Ford and GM, among many others. One of the first instances that actually influenced legislation nationally was the Good Roads Everywhere initiative. This was an initiative from the National Highways Association to promote better roads, because a lot of the roads at the time around the United States were not quite the greatest. And while the railroad certainly existed, there needed to be other forms of transit to not have that being the only way to get from place to place. So Charles Henry Davis would end up giving a lot of coal mines to help out Ford, to help Henry Ford directly, and promote more car usage. The Davis family had considerable holdings in coal fields of Harlan County, Kentucky. Carl approached Henry with the proposition that he lease his entire Centennia area to him on the basis that Ford will do all the mining himself and pay Davis the agreed price per carload of coal at the mine shed, plus a royalty on each 4 car that was produced. Davis himself did try to promote several types of transportation, such as tram lines, although road infrastructure was the main thing that he did focus on. So what I do want to mention with Davis's original plan is that he wanted there to be like about 14 highways within the Metro Detroit area, specifically in Detroit, which, I mean, that's a lot of highways, but for the time, it was just more so to transport necessary items and goods between one place to another. And obviously, all of this itself isn't that bad, but it was what followed that ended up becoming slightly problematic. So a lot of streetcars ended up being torn up in most American cities in the next 2 decades or so. One of the main reasons supposedly was that they were unprofitable and slow, so automobiles were the preferred vehicle at the time. Now, looking back from current times, this does look like a huge monopoly that was just trying to take over everything, although it's labeled a conspiracy to go that far to say that. Even according to a Vox article by Stromberg, it states that the real reasons for the streetcar's demise are much less nefarious than a GM-driven conspiracy, although even he admits it's kind of frustrating if you're a transit fan. Although that isn't to say that automobile companies never had trouble with this. For instance, in Los Angeles, General Motors was claimed to have been monopolizing the entire transit system there, with trying to promote cars and buses run by GM. So GM did face backlash from a court in Chicago that essentially found them guilty of monopolizing the public transit in the area. General Motors had been involved in the replacement of more than 100 electric transit systems with GM buses in 45 cities. In April of that year, a Chicago federal jury convicted GM of having criminally conspired with Standard Oil of California, Firestone Tire, and others to replace electrical transportation with gas or diesel-powered buses and monopolize the sale of buses related to products to local transportation companies throughout the country. And although this really only affected Los Angeles, it still applies here because, for instance, here GM had control of multiple cities' transportation one way or another. Maybe not directly, but their influence certainly was undeniable. Both GM and Ford had a huge hold on the automobile industry as they were both part of the big three. Although from the looks of it, it doesn't seem like they were able to accuse them of anything more other than just possibly monopolizing it, so they ended up imposing a $5,000 sanction on General Motors. One of the key people involved in monopolizing this area specifically was H.C. Grossman, and he was actually also fined a total of $1. So the actual impact of this feared monopoly really ended up not being a legal challenge in the long run, especially just after like 2 decades or so. But yeah, I mean, the government was willing to work with car companies and help lobby pretty much anything in favor of them. And then by 1956, there's the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act that was passed, which guaranteed that highways would be built more frequently in the country. After the 1950s, car-dependent infrastructure was really the only type of infrastructure that was built in the United States, especially out west. And specifically in Southeastern Michigan, it was pretty much the start of auto companies lobbying what type of infrastructure to build and demolishing areas specifically for car infrastructure and like parking and everything. It hasn't been until the past decade or two that cities have decided to build more alternatives to driving, such as reintroducing tram lines, building subway systems, although subway systems have been around for a while, but mainly just in cities, and bike infrastructure too. And this next section, I'm going to discuss this more later, but keep in mind that most Americans, the vast majority of Americans, do drive between work and home, and that really does play an impact on the environment. But first, what I have to say. So back on March 23rd, I went to Ann Arbor to do my ethnography. So essentially I used Ann Arbor as a case study for Southeastern Michigan on what could be the best public transit in the area. And I actually shot some videos there, mainly just to like keep things in mind about my own notes. But I also wanted to use it here. To Ann Arbor. You gotta find public transit now. So I was under the impression that Ann Arbor had probably the best public transit in the entire state, because as I mentioned at the beginning, public transit really isn't that advocated for, especially in Michigan. Public transit in the United States, unfortunately, is quite frowned upon, with a lot of Americans generally believing that it's more geared towards people who can't afford cars. Although keeping that in mind, it's not like cars are necessarily a luxury, it's more of a necessity in many of these places. But regardless, I came into Ann Arbor expecting to see really good transit, and I guess it was unusual for a place in Michigan that has that amount of people to have like 2 bus lines, completely separate entities, the university and the main city one. But overall, I ended up finding out that they pretty much did the bare minimum. The Blake Transit Center, which is where the ride is, was generally a pretty small station and somewhat out of the way from the rest of the downtown. Okay, one down. I didn't really record that because I was just getting information. Got a pamphlet and some information on, I guess, yeah, that the transit here is separate from the university, but M cars are still accepted. And I'm probably going to head down to the Amtrak station now, which is kind of on the other end of the north end. So the buses more or less had the reputation for being not the most reliable. Although, to be fair, when I was there, I did get a decent amount of information on like what routes to take, and I was even given a schedule of all the train lines, public train lines that you can go on in Michigan. And that also leads me to talking about the train lines. Trains have been improving in the past couple of years, even to pre-pandemic numbers, which was genuinely shocking because while the actual terminals might not have the most amount of people at the same time, it's been on a rising trend, which is really good to see. So from what I could gather at the Amtrak station, the lady was pretty helpful with like the information available. Ooh, I don't know how much I trust this is an underpass. No, look at that. Manual. They have trains that go to, Chicago and Pontiac mainly. And, yeah, that's really about it. I mean, they also go to Port Huron, but ridership has increased, especially since the pandemic, from what I can gather. And, what else? Yeah, she recommended they were originally called NARP, the People Railroad Association, so they also have some information there, so pretty cool. Actually, when I was at the station at Dearborn, not only did they give me one of these sheets, but I was also given a guide of the train that goes directly to Florida from here. Maybe not the most direct route, but regardless. But specifically what I found, at least in Michigan, the train industry with Amtrak is actually improving. They actually have a lot more information than Ann Arbor.
slowly but surely, because it's still quite underfunded regardless. And on top of that, transit centers are kind of out of the way. They're usually a couple blocks outside of downtown, which might not seem far, but if you're bringing luggage, if you're going from somewhere else, that's generally pretty inconvenient.
Here's the station at Dearborn, the train station. And of course it has to be basically snowing, even though it's April. But yeah, so it's pretty close to downtown. Downtown's just over there. But actually driving here was a bit of a pain, surprisingly, because I was driving up that way. I mean, it's definitely like accessible. That's not a problem. But yeah, it's not as convenient. I mean, here in Dearborn, it's probably pretty convenient, I would say. I would assume it's pretty convenient, but like for someone who lives in like a suburb, like Dearborn Heights in my case, or for people living in other cities like Livonia or Novi, the public transit there, aside from just bus routes that can be kind of random, cannot be the most reliable, I would say.
Ann Arbor Station, the Blake's Transit Center, was a good 3-4 city blocks away from the actual downtown area. Even the university buses would be a bit slow and not really drop you off in the best locations. And for the possibility of taking anything other than a car, you really need connections to be better than just accomplishing the bare minimum, I suppose.
Just talking about transportation in general, I am noticing outside of the downtown, like the really city center of Ann Arbor, there's kind of a lack of bike lanes. Now they can drive on the road compared to other cities, so that has a difference. Also, different parking rules depending on the place. That said 2-hour parking, I guess, on the street. So there is that when it comes to transportation. As for the street, it's actually really interesting. So it either turns into a boulevard or like way smaller from the bridge, because the bridge has like two lanes, I guess 4 lanes total, and kind of wider. So that's interesting on that end.
I also use the buses at the university, and generally speaking, they don't really have like an information area. It's just you go on the bus, just look at the line, and that's pretty much it. It also does the bare minimum for getting people from one campus to another.
I don't really know, just trying to look around. No, I don't really need video, it's just, I don't know what else I'm gonna do. So, other than protesting and protest signs and people waiting, that was about it here. And there's the sustainability building, so could check that out for a couple minutes. Alright, so it was pretty good. I would say, like, so the highway, I-94 was good. Then when we got into Ann Arbor, it was like 30, like that entire stretch, which is fine. But then as soon as like all the pedestrians came, it was a bit more brutal. But we're here. What we got here? Those are bike poles. Okay, so went to the student center. They don't really have information about like sustainable cities. They did mention, what was mentioned is that what's it called, LSA might have something about urban planning, so could check that out. Oh, where's your guys' like urban planning stuff? Wait, so you guys don't have any urban planning stuff?
No, it's on our campus.
Okay. Went here and found out they do not have urban planning stuff here. It's on North Campus, which gives me a reason to go there now, actually. And there she goes. Hopefully that wasn't the wrong stop. So talk to Aaron. He just mainly gave information about like the majors and stuff with urban planning, but as for like actual information about the city, I could email some of the professors, so that's what I got out of that.
Now, Detroit's an interesting story because up until about 10 years ago, their transit was pretty much worse than Ann Arbor. Now they actually have the Q line, which is a tram that goes around downtown Detroit and goes to a couple different places, most notably by the DIA, the waterfront, or just at the border of the waterfront where the fist statue is. The day that I went on there, there was actually a protest going on, which is why there's so many people on board, because usually there's not that many people who are taking the Q line.
Going on the Q line.
A
lot of people.
A lot of people, good.
Yeah. And it was definitely a breeze having that ability to go through Detroit without having to take a car and just park continuously somewhere else, like if we need to go to another part of the city. And another point that I want to mention with Detroit and the general suburbs is that even the sidewalks are pretty good.
I decided the Village Plaza will be my, I don't know, I guess my destination, because I want to break 10,000 steps. I'm probably pretty close to there already. Sidewalks seem pretty decent actually here in Dearborn Heights, or Dearborn. That's nice. And it's a nice day. Super green.
Unlike out west, where sidewalks can be quite non-existent, there are a decent amount of sidewalks to get around, both within city centers and also around transit stations.
For like a town like Dearborn, which is kind of college-oriented, it's not too bad to walk around. It's just there's not a lot to do. And still obviously car-oriented.
Although that doesn't really apply to all the suburbs. Like Livonia is one of the cities that sticks out because that's a more wealthy area, generally speaking, and there's just like no sidewalks there. As for how we can reimagine this, there are many countries that have already actually implemented change, most notably the Netherlands. Since 1992, an act of legislation known as Duurzaam Veilig, also known as Sustainable Safety, was a series of acts that was passed in the Netherlands that both made transportation less free market based and also made an effort to have multiple different ways to transit throughout the country. It's also important to note they ended up differentiating between mainly like what would be considered highways, side roads along the highways, and streets where speeds are a lot slower and people can actually walk around. And for the Netherlands in the past several years, this has actually improved car infrastructure. I'll get into this in a second, but overall this type of legislation is something that is really a step in the right direction. Now, one of the other things I want to mention is that just car travel in general in cities isn't really necessary. Now, getting more into that, we go into the future implications.
He just honked at me.
So why does this all matter? How does this relate to the UN sustainability goal? So an excess of car infrastructure and car dependency leads to greater carbon emissions coming from vehicles. And even according to the EPA, both passenger cars and trucks currently make up the leading source of carbon emissions from transportation. And also transportation is the largest sector of greenhouse gases total. So cutting down on this might not be a bad idea. And in this place, bus, bike, and rail transit can serve many of those functions that these would typically have. Trains emit significantly less carbon than cars in order to run, and they carry a lot more people. Now, one counter-argument relates to personal freedom, the fear that taking away car access means taking away freedom of movement, and that people would be like trapped in 15-minute cities. At least that's been more popular in the past couple of years, especially from conservative-leaning outlets. In actuality, this really doesn't do that. Places with viable alternatives to car travel have better car infrastructure. Cars aren't consistently tearing up roads every time that someone needs to go to work because people can take other ways, either via trains or even bike, to get to where they need to work. And with these other alternatives, there would be less car congestion and less pollution. Now, the US isn't exactly the same as the Netherlands. The Netherlands is one of the densest countries in Europe, and having a huge amount of road infrastructure isn't really necessary. But even with that said, most cities in the US are pretty dense themselves, so having the ability to take more public transit and zoning areas as mixed use rather than single family housing can really cut back on commuting times and also rising carbon emissions. As for the concluding remarks, if we want to be global citizens, we have to create more sustainable environments to help upkeep our world and work together to sustain our resources. And while these might sound like drastic measures for the US, certainly this isn't a problem in most other countries across the planet. Whether you're in Japan or Germany, most developed places across the world have multiple ways of getting around, aside from just solely cars. And for instance, that's the reason why some places like even Japan are able to be as orderly as they are. It really doesn't feel that like claustrophobic or that packed all the time due to multiple ways to get around, to get to other places, and again, the viable alternatives are really important. And upkeeping our environment is really important if we want to continue living on this planet. And we shouldn't have to isolate ourselves in thinking that this is the only way that we can do transit, just car dependency, when it clearly isn't. Now, per se, undoing this probably isn't really possible in the US, but at least here, there are multiple downtown areas that could be a lot more dense if necessary. That could even bring down housing prices, because the housing crisis that's currently going on, that could be a step in the right direction for that too. So we need to work with what we have to the best of our ability. But if we cannot sustain our resources, it will lead to a lower quality of life and environmental degradation. We need to work together in order to sustain this planet, because it's the only thing that we have.